Balancing combat encounters in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition is one of those things that can be very difficult to do. And in this video, I take the research and experience that I've done to make my games better, and I'm sharing it with you, so hopefully you can gain some inspiration from this video, maybe get some of your own ideas, and make your games even just a little bit better. Before we venture much farther into this video, roll initiative. If you roll higher than me, like this video. If I roll higher than you, subscribe. So the first place I would start, the Dungeon Master's Guide on page 85 actually has a formula for determining the relative difficulty of any given combat encounter that you may prepare. It works by taking into account the number of players you have in the party and their respective levels, as well as the number of monsters are in the encounter and their given experience points. So to do it, you first determine your player's experience point threshold. There's a chart on the page that tells you what number of experience points each singular player of each level can handle for an easy, medium, hard, or deadly encounter. And so to determine your party's experience threshold, you simply add up all those numbers together. So if you have 4 level 1 adventurers, then you will add up 25, 50, 75, and 100 respectively for easy, medium, difficult, and deadly encounters. So a medium encounter, the experience threshold for a party of 4 level 1 adventurers is 50 times 4, or 50 added 4 times, which gets you 200. So now you determine, okay, what is the modified experience points for the monsters that are in the encounter? So this works by taking each of the monsters, looking at their individual XP point value, and adding all of those together. And then there's another chart that gives you a multiplier based on how many monsters are in the encounter. Let's say you have some goblins. They each have 25 experience points. Add those together, and if there are 6 or more goblins, you multiply that total by 2. If there's less than that, that's about 3 to 4 monsters, it's by 1.5, and 2 monsters, I believe, is multiplied by 1. And so that number you end up with is what is supposed to be the experience points that represent how difficult that encounter will be for the players. You compare that total to your player's experience point threshold, and it'll line up somewhere on the chart to be easy, medium, difficult, or deadly for those players. Now, I have found personally that this works reliably about half the time, because there's a lot of things that it doesn't take into account. It only assumes an adventuring party of 4 to 5 players. It doesn't take into account you could have more or less. You'll obviously have to adjust the numbers accordingly with that. The formula also doesn't take into account things like players' abilities and monsters' abilities. Specifically, things like multi-attack, extra attack, and that sort of thing. Because when it comes to combat, action economy is very, very important. Action economy is basically how many actions every creature involved in that combat has per round. The side with the greater number of actions per round is usually the side that ends up winning any given combat encounter. Generally, that rule works pretty good. I would say that having a truly balanced encounter might look something like this. You have 4 level 1 adventurers, and they fight 4 bandits. And the reason that I think this is so balanced is because, first of all, the players are all usually small to medium humanoid creatures. The bandits are also medium humanoid creatures, so they have similar size. Also, level 1 character hit points and bandit hit points, if you add this together and create a pool, generally pretty comparable numbers. Every player as a level 1 has 1 action per turn. All the bandits have 1 action per turn. And the damage output potential for level 1 players and bandits is also quite similar, with very basic attacks of like 1d6 plus 2 or 3, something along those lines. Sometimes players will have a greater potential for damage than the bandits, and that gives them a bit of an edge. So everything across the board is balanced, and that includes the action economy. Where this starts to go a bit askew, if you take that same adventuring party and pit them against a bandit captain or bandit chief. Now, the bandit chief is only 1 medium-sized humanoid, and the players are 4. The players still have their 4 actions per round. The bandit captain has a multi-attack feature, which means he can attack twice per round. And the players have twice as many actions per round, so they have the higher action economy. They should be able to win this fight, except that the bandit captain also has a much greater damage potential with each of his actions, and he has significantly more health points than any one of the players. So in that sense, even though the players have more actions, the encounter is very unbalanced because Bandit Captain is just so much stronger of an enemy than regular bandits are. Now, that can also work the opposite way, where the players end up on top in a similar situation. And I actually had this happen to me in one of my games recently. So I had 4 level 5 characters, and I pit them against one hill giant, because hill giants have a challenge rating of 5, which means, or is supposed to mean, that that creature should be somewhat difficult for an assumed adventuring party of 4 to 5 level 5 characters. In this case, it really wasn't a challenge at all. The players rolled initiative, and they all rolled higher than the hill giant. Then there was a wizard in the party, and he decided to cast Thunderbolt, which is basically fireball but deals thunder damage instead of fire damage. And he crit on his first attack on this hill giant. So the hill giant took tons of thunder damage, took out most of his hit points in the first round before the hill giant even had one of its actions. Now the hill giant also has multi-attack, and so he, in this instance, I had him throw 2 boulders. One boulder missed, another boulder hit, but he rolled really low for damage. Next round, the players simply mopped him up. The wizard used Thunderbolt again and finished the hill giant off. So looking back on that particular encounter, if I wanted to make that more difficult, I would have added a second, maybe even a third hill giant to make that reflect the difficulty I intended for the players. Because as level 5s, they are much more powerful than they were even at level 3. And I didn't use the formula at all. If I had, I probably would have figured out, okay, this is going to be an easy encounter for these players. So it's a good idea to use that on page 85 beforehand anyway. And I would say the challenge rating of a monster really isn't very useful when it comes to balancing combat. So don't use that. Focus on the experience points, and as a general rule of thumb, if you want to have an encounter be easier, add less monsters. If you want it to be harder, add more monsters, because their action economy increases, and so the difficulty of that encounter will multiply exponentially. That said, you can take into account the number of players you have, their level, the number of monsters you have. You can use that rule of thumb, adding more to make it harder, adding less to make it easier, and there are still a couple of X factors that make balancing difficult. The first one is magic items. So magic items are kind of a wild card when it comes to Dungeons & Dragons, especially in combat encounters. And if your players have a magic item they picked up from a dungeon somewhere, they could use that in combat. And of course, the formula on page 85 does not take that into account at all. Now you might think, well, as a dungeon master, I know they have that magic item. But what you have to do is think, but do my monsters know that they have the magic item? I would say it's if you're like boss monster, within relative reason, has the ability to know that they have that magic item or anticipate they might have that magic item, then yes, you can prepare the encounter so that the villain is prepared in case they use that item. But if the players come across a random troop of goblins, those goblins aren't going to know that the players have that magic item. And so it's kind of unfair for you as the dungeon master to prepare that encounter with that magic item in mind, because the monsters don't know they have it. So that is a bit of a word of caution when it comes to magic items. Now, you can give your monsters magic items too. Now this, of course, is another way to make a combat encounter more difficult, because you give that monster a bit of an edge they normally don't have. In addition to adding more monsters, you can give your monsters magic items and they can use those against your players, and that always creates a very interesting scenario that your players will not soon forget. And of course, the biggest X factor, as I sort of talked about with my hill giant example, is the dice rolls. On average, monsters and players are not always going to roll really well, and they're not always going to roll really bad. That's just statistically how dice work. But it is still up to chance. In my hill giant example, all the players rolled really well on their initiative, and one player made a crit with a very powerful spell and took that hill giant right out. The hill giant rolled poorly, and his attack roll didn't do nearly as much damage as it could have, so the players walked away practically unscathed. At the end of the day, you can do your best to create a combat that will have a certain challenge for your players, but there's no way to anticipate how the dice are going to roll. So there's really only so much you can do, but that is also kind of what makes D&D very fun, is because it gives combat a level of uncertainty. The way the dice roll, things can happen that you don't plan for, and that's kind of how combat works. It's supposed to be chaotic, and no one really knows exactly how it's going to end. You might have a good idea, but there's no way to tell precisely. So that said, what I've found is that the best way to really balance your combat encounters is just through trial and error. Like I said, there are some rules of thumb. You can use the Dungeon Master's Guide, page 85, to plan encounters and determine the relative difficulty of an encounter. You can add more monsters to make it harder, take away monsters to make it easier. You can give your players or your monsters magic items to give them a bit of an edge in combat. And at the end of the day, you just have to run the combat scenario and see how it plays out. If it's going downhill for your players and you don't want them all to die, you can make some narrative decisions and say, oh, these goblins see you are about to succumb to your wounds, and they decide to capture you instead of finishing you off. And now your players are faced with a new challenge. They have to escape these goblins, and that creates a very interesting storytelling element to the game. You can also remind your players that if they are about to get totally taken out by this giant, that they can run away. They don't have to stay and fight. That's something that I've found, especially newer players, often forget, is that D&D combat is not like a video game where you're stuck in the combat till the end and one side dies and one side lives. No, you can decide to leave. You can run away. And if there's one thing you should never do, never put just one monster against all your players, because especially at higher levels, that just ends up being a pretty boring combat encounter because it's super easy. I don't know, maybe your players will like that. Maybe you can throw him a bone every now and again and be like, you know what, there's a giant, but he's alone, and you can have this one. You know, give them that sense of power before you throw them into a big boss fight and they're scrambling for resources and have no idea what to do. Don't overthink it, and just have fun.